While a 75-year-old farmer works under the sun in his small green garden, his straw hat protecting his face, marked by decades of hard work. Suddenly, the roar of an imported car breaks the peace. A man in an elegant suit walks arrogantly among the rows of vegetables that represent the old man's only livelihood. "Your deadline is up, stubborn old man," he shouts, before pouring fuel over the crops and lighting a match, turning months of work into devastating flames. What the aggressor doesn't realize is that the farmer's faithful white horse is watching the entire scene closely, his intelligent eyes reflecting something beyond human comprehension. What happens next will leave everyone in shock. Sweat trickled slowly down Antonio Miller's wrinkled face as his calloused hands delicately stroked the green leaves of the season's last cabbage. At 72, every movement was calculated, the result of 4 decades farming the same land his father had left him. His faded straw hat, a faithful companion through countless mornings of labor, only partially protected his face, marked by time and the unrelenting summer sun. The small garden plot stretched before him like a living carpet of green and gold hues. Perfectly aligned rows of ripe tomatoes gave off their sweet aroma, mingling with the damp scent of freshly watered earth. Lettuce heads swayed gently in the afternoon breeze, while the constant hum of bees created a natural symphony that had lulled his days for as long as he could remember. Antonio paused for a moment, straightening his back with a low groan that escaped him involuntarily. His brown eyes, still bright despite his age, surveyed every corner of his property with the silent pride of someone who had built something with his own hands. There was the fruit of his entire life, carrots that grew straight and strong, pumpkins that promised to feed entire families, and the greens he took every week to the town's farmers' market. But even amidst the beauty of his creation, a shadow weighed heavily on his heart. Bills piled up on the kitchen table like dark clouds before a storm. Liberty Bank had raised interest rates again, and this season's harvest would barely cover half of what he owed. He knew that each harvested cabbage represented not just sustenance, but a small battle won against time that was running against him. On the other side of the fence, Hope, his 15-year-old albino mare, watched everything with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand every nuance of her owner's mood. The animal had arrived at the farm as a filly, a gift from Antonio's late wife, and had since become his most faithful companion. Hope had the peculiar habit of approaching whenever she sensed he was troubled, as if to offer silent comfort. The old farmer smiled faintly as he saw the mare approach the fence, nodding her white head towards him. "Today we harvest the last of the cabbages, girl," he murmured softly, reaching out to stroke the animal's velvety muzzle. "God willing, it'll be enough to pay the electricity bill this month at least." The afternoon passed peacefully, the sun beginning to dip below the horizon when Antonio returned his attention to the task. Each cabbage was carefully examined before harvesting, his experienced hands identifying the exact point of ripeness. It was a ritual he performed with the same reverence as a prayer, for he knew that each vegetable represented hope. The bucolic silence was broken only by the distant call of a cardinal and the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. It was one of those moments when life seemed suspended in time, where the simplicity of working the land offered a peace no wealth could buy. Antonio felt connected to generations of ancestors who had worked that same land, cultivating not just food, but traditions and values. But this serenity was about to be violently interrupted. The distant sound of an approaching engine made Hope perk her ears up in alarm. It was a rumble different from the tractors and trucks that occasionally passed on the dirt road. This sound had something aggressive, urban about it, that didn't fit the rural harmony of the place. Antonio looked up, shielding his eyes from the sun's glare, trying to identify the approaching vehicle. His heart began to pound faster, for something deep inside him told him that peaceful afternoon was coming to an end. The luxury sedan emerged from the dusty road like an open wound on the serene landscape. It was a gleaming black vehicle, completely out of place in that rural setting, its chrome wheels brutally contrasting with the simplicity of the surroundings. The engine's rumble ceased abruptly when the vehicle stopped a few yards from the property entrance, leaving a tense silence in the air. Antonio felt his stomach clench as he recognized the man stepping out of the car. Richard Sterling, 52, owner of the region's largest real estate development firm, wore an impeccable blue suit that didn't show a single speck of dust from the journey. His Italian leather shoes gleamed under the afternoon sun, and his cold eyes surveyed the property with the calculated precision of a predator assessing its prey. "Good afternoon, Mr. Miller," Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, walking towards the worn wooden gate. His voice carried a forced cordiality that made every word sound like a thinly veiled threat. "I see you're working hard as ever." The farmer straightened slowly, wiping his dirt-stained hands on his faded apron. They had met 3 times in the last 2 months, always with the same purpose Antonio adamantly refused to accept. "If you've come with the same old talk, you can save your time and mine and leave." Richard chuckled softly, a humorless sound that made Hope stir nervously on the other side of the fence. The mare seemed to sense the tension in the air, her attentive eyes fixed on the unwelcome visitor. "Mr. Miller, you are a stubborn man. That stubbornness has already brought you enough trouble, don't you think?" "My land isn't for sale," Antonio replied firmly, although his voice betrayed a slight tremor. "I've told you that 3 times, and I'll repeat it as many times as necessary. This land has belonged to my family for 5 generations. The businessman walked slowly between the rows of greens, his elegant hands lightly touching the green leaves as if appraising merchandise. 5 generations working hard for what, Mr. Miller? To accumulate debt, to live paycheck to paycheck, not knowing if you'll make ends meet." The words hit Antonio like punches to the gut. It was true that financial difficulties had become a constant in his life, but he would never admit it to that man. "My problems are none of your business." "Oh, but they are," Richard retorted, turning back to his car and opening the trunk. "You owe a considerable amount to Liberty Bank, don't you? Overdue interest, late payments. Must be very stressful to sleep every night, knowing they could take all this from you at any moment." Antonio's heart pounded. How did that man know such intimate details of his financial situation? "How did you—" "Information is power, my dear fellow," Richard interrupted, pulling out a red gas can, holding it with frightening casualness. The strong smell of gasoline began to spread through the air as he opened the cap. "What do you think you're doing?" Antonio shouted, taking a step forward, but stopping when he saw the icy expression in the businessman's eyes. "I'm offering you one last chance to be reasonable," Richard said calmly, beginning to walk towards the vegetables. "My offer still stands. I'll buy your property for a fair price, pay off all your debts, and you'll still have money left over to live comfortably elsewhere." "Never," Antonio exploded, trying to place himself between Richard and the garden. "You can't do this. It's a crime." Richard smiled coldly. "Crime is not paying your debts, Mr. Miller. Crime is being stubborn when life offers you a dignified way out." He raised the gas can over the first row of cabbages. "Last chance. Accept my offer or—" "No!" Antonio shouted. But his words were lost in the air as the flammable liquid began to pour over his precious vegetables, saturating months of hard work with the acrid smell of impending destruction. The transparent liquid ran down the green leaves like poisonous tears, impregnating each plant with the nauseating smell of destruction. Antonio watched in horror as Richard methodically walked between the rows, pouring fuel over months of dedicated work. Every drop that fell on his vegetables was like a stab to his heart. "Stop! Please, stop!" the old farmer pleaded, running after the businessman with hands outstretched in desperation. "These plants are all I have. They're my only source of income." Richard continued his destructive work with the cold resolve of an executioner carrying out a sentence. "You can still change your mind, Mr. Miller. One word from you and I'll stop right now. Just say you agree to sell the property." "Never!" Antonio shouted, trying to snatch the can from the businessman's hands, but Richard pushed him away forcefully, making the old man stumble backward. "This land is sacred. My grandfather died defending this patch of ground." "Your grandfather was a fool, just like you," Richard retorted crudely, emptying the can over the last of the season's tomatoes. "Sentimentality doesn't pay debts. Tradition doesn't put food on the table." On the other side of the fence, Hope began to whinny loudly, stirring nervously. The mare sensed the danger even before the flames appeared, her animal instincts picking up on the impending catastrophe. She ran back and forth, trying to draw her owner's attention to the horror about to unfold. Richard completely emptied the can, making sure every bed was soaked in the flammable liquid. The strong smell completely dominated the air, suffocating the sweet aroma that usually emanated from the thriving garden. It was as if the very essence of the place had been corrupted by human malice. "Last chance," the businessman said, taking a matchbox from his suit jacket pocket. His manicured fingers toyed with the small box, making it spin slowly between his fingers. "You have 10 seconds to accept my offer." Antonio fell to his knees in the middle of his ruined garden, his hands trembling as he touched the fuel-soaked plants. Silent tears streamed down his wrinkled face, mixing with the sweat of honest labor that had just been desecrated. "Why are you doing this to me? What harm have I done to you?" "No personal harm," Richard replied with indifference. "It's just business. This land is worth far more than you imagine. There are companies interested in building an industrial complex here, and I intend to profit from it. 10, 9, 8. He began to count, striking a match that lit with a dry crack. "Don't do it," Antonio pleaded, trying to get up. "These plants feed entire families in town. You're destroying the livelihood of innocent people. 7, 6, 5. Richard continued relentlessly, bringing the lit match closer to the fuel-soaked vegetables. Hope whinnied desperately, as if trying to warn of something terrible about to happen. Her intelligent eyes fixed on the businessman with almost human intensity, as if memorizing every detail of that cruel act. 4, 3, 2. "All right," Antonio finally cried, his voice broken by defeat. "I accept. I'll sell. Just don't destroy everything." Richard smiled with satisfaction, but he didn't extinguish the match. "Ah, Mr. Miller, now it's too late. You had 3 opportunities to be reasonable. This is the consequence of your stubbornness." And with a casual, almost nonchalant movement, he tossed the lit match onto the soaked plants. The flames spread instantly, creating a wall of fire that raced through the rows with terrifying speed. The intense heat hit Antonio's face like a slap, while the sound of the flames consuming his entire life echoed through the air like screams of agony. The fire transformed the peaceful afternoon into an orange nightmare, where a lifetime's work turned to ashes in a matter of minutes. The fire devoured everything with an insatiable hunger that seemed alive, leaping from plant to plant like a demon dancing over the wreckage of Antonio's dreams. The orange flames licked the afternoon sky, creating a curtain of black smoke that partially obscured the sun and transformed the idyllic setting into a war zone. Antonio ran desperately towards the flames, trying to save at least a few plants with his bare hands. The intense heat burned his exposed skin, but he ignored the physical pain that couldn't compare to the agony tearing at his soul. "No, no, no!" he cried repeatedly, as if his words could stop the destruction. "Mr. Miller, get back," Richard ordered, feigning concern. "The fire could spread to you." "Shut up!" roared the old farmer, turning to the businessman with eyes red from tears and smoke. "You destroyed my life. 40 years of work turned to ashes by your greed." The businessman watched the scene with thinly veiled satisfaction, his cold eyes reflecting the flames like demonic mirrors. He had already put away the matchbox and calmly adjusted his tie, as if he had just concluded a routine business transaction. Hope continued to whinny loudly on the other side of the fence, growing more agitated as the flames spread. The mare seemed to grasp the magnitude of the tragedy unfolding before her eyes. Her hooves nervously beat the ground, creating small dust clouds that contrasted with the dense smoke dominating the air. Antonio desperately tried to use a bucket of water he kept near the shed, but the few droplets he managed to throw on the flames were completely useless against the fire's intensity. It was like trying to put out a volcano with tears. Each attempt only served to make his powerlessness against the calculated destruction more evident. "I'll call the fire department," he shouted, running towards the house in search of the phone. "Don't bother," Richard said calmly, checking his gold wristwatch. "They'll take at least 40 minutes to get here. By then, there'll be nothing left to save." The businessman's words were another stab to Antonio's already bleeding heart. It was true the town was far, and the volunteer firefighters in the area didn't have adequate equipment to fight a fire of that magnitude. He was completely alone in the face of catastrophe. The fire consumed the ripe tomatoes in seconds, transforming months of careful growth into a carbonized paste. The lettuce, which that morning had still swayed delicately in the breeze, were now just black silhouettes twisted by the heat. The cabbages he had harvested with such care hours earlier were now balls of fire, rolling across the ground like miniature meteors. "Why did you do this?" Antonio asked, his voice reduced to a raspy whisper. "I said I'd sell. Why did you destroy everything anyway?" Richard smiled cruelly. "Because I needed to make sure you understood who's in charge here. This was a lesson in power, Mr. Miller. A demonstration that when I want something, I get it." The smoke was getting so thick Antonio began to cough violently. His elderly lungs couldn't properly filter the contaminated air, and he felt a terrible burning in his throat. But even so, he refused to move away, like a captain who doesn't abandon his sinking ship. The flames finally began to subside when there was nothing left to burn. What remained of the garden was a field of black earth sprinkled with ashes and carbonized remains. The acrid smell of smoke now mixed with the sweet, bitter odor of burnt plants, creating an aroma Antonio knew would haunt his memories forever. Richard walked back to his car, wiping his hands as if he had just completed a dirty but necessary job. "My offer still stands, Mr. Miller. When you're ready to be sensible, come find me." The rumble of the luxury car's engine broke the silence that had fallen after the flames died down, leaving Antonio alone amidst the wreckage of his life. The silence that followed the luxury car's departure was deafening, filled only by the soft rustle of ashes carried by the afternoon wind. Antonio remained motionless in the center of his destroyed garden, like a pillar of salt in the desert of his own tragedy. His legs trembled so much he couldn't take a single step. Hope, on the other side of the fence, had stopped whinnying and now watched her owner with eyes that seemed to comprehend the depth of his loss. The mare slowly approached the nearest fence, stretching her neck towards Antonio as if to offer comfort with her presence. Her intelligent eyes shone with an almost human sadness. The farmer fell heavily to his knees on the still warm earth, his hands touching the carbonized remains of what had been his livelihood. The plants that morning had promised sustenance for another month were now just memories turned to dust. He picked up a handful of ashes between his fingers, letting them slowly sift like sand in an hourglass marking the end of an era. 40 years, he murmured to himself, his voice sounding strange in the silence. 40 years building all this, and in 10 minutes it was nothing. The reality of his situation began to settle in his mind like an overwhelming weight. Without the harvest, there would be no money to pay the bills due next week. Without income, the bank debts would become unpayable in a matter of days. It was as if Richard had cut all the ropes that kept him suspended over a financial abyss. Antonio forced himself to his feet, his joints protesting the movement. He walked slowly through the wreckage, mentally cataloguing everything he had lost. There, where now only burnt earth remained, grew the tomatoes that Maria expected for her preserves. Further on, where ashes danced in the wind, was the lettuce the town restaurant had ordered for the week. Each step revealed a new loss, a new bill that couldn't be paid, a new family that would be without the fresh produce that depended on his garden. It was a chain reaction of consequences that spread far beyond his property, affecting the entire small community that depended on his produce. How will I explain it to people?" he asked aloud, addressing Hope as if the mayor could offer answers. "How will I tell Rose that I won't have carrots for her sick grandson? How will I look John from the corner store in the eye and explain that I can no longer provide greens for his shop?" The mayor whinnied softly, a low, melancholic sound that seemed like an attempt at solace. Antonio walked to the fence and reached out to stroke the animal's soft muzzle. It was the only human, or almost human contact he had left in that moment of utter desolation. "At least you're still here, girl," he whispered, feeling his legs weaken again. "At least we haven't lost each other." But even this consolation was quickly replaced by a new concern. How would he feed Hope without money for feed? How would he pay the vet if she got sick? Every thought generated 3 new problems, creating a downward spiral of anxiety that threatened to consume him. The sun was beginning to set on the horizon, painting the sky in orange hues that cruelly reminded him of the flames that had destroyed his life. Antonio knew he needed to go inside before the darkness made what was already the worst day of his existence even bleaker. But as he turned to walk towards the house, his eyes caught something that made him stop abruptly. On the porch table, where he always left important papers, there was a white envelope that hadn't been there that morning. Someone had been on his property during the fire and had left a message that would likely make that day even more terrible than it already was. With hands still trembling from the shock of the events, Antonio walked slowly towards the porch. Each step sounded hollow against the worn wooden planks, echoing like the beats of a heart struggling to keep going. The white envelope stood out against the dark table like a patch of snow on burnt earth. His hands hesitated for a moment before picking up the envelope. Something deep inside him told him that paper contained bad news, and he had already received enough bad news for a lifetime that day. But curiosity overcame fear, and he carefully tore open the edge of the envelope. Inside was an official letterhead stamped with the emblem of a company he didn't recognize. Sterling Financial Solutions, LLC. The Sterling name made his stomach clench with a terrible suspicion. It couldn't be a coincidence that that surname appeared right after Richard's attack. The letter was direct and brutal in its cold, legal language. "Dear Mr. Antonio Miller, we inform you that your debt with Liberty Bank has been transferred to our credit recovery company. The total updated amount is $47,832.15, due in 15 calendar days from this date. Should full payment not be received, we will proceed with all applicable legal measures for credit recovery, including the foreclosure of real estate assets." Antonio read the letter 3 times before the words made complete sense in his stunned mind. Someone had bought his debt from the bank and now demanded immediate payment. It was a tactic he had heard of, but never imagined it could happen to him. 15 days, he murmured to himself, sitting heavily in the rocking chair his late wife had loved so much. How will I come up with almost $50,000 in 15 days? The answer was obvious and terrifying. He wouldn't. Even with the harvest intact, it would take months to gather that amount. Now, with the garden destroyed, it was simply impossible. It was as if someone had carefully planned every move to completely corner him. The suspicion that had been germinating in his mind since he saw the name Sterling on the letterhead began to grow like a poisonous plant. Could Richard have orchestrated all this, buying his debt destroying his income source and then demanding immediate payment? Hope approached the porch as if sensing her owner needed company. The mare rested her head on the low railing that surrounded the porch, her large, expressive eyes fixed on Antonio's devastated face. It was as if she understood that something very serious had happened beyond the garden's destruction. "They want to take us from here, girl," Antonio said softly, reaching out to stroke the mare's silky mane. "They want our land, and they'll use any dirty method to get it." The old telephone in the house rang, interrupting the moment of silent communion between the man and the animal. Antonio hesitated before answering, fearing it was more bad news. But something inside him, perhaps a last thread of hope, made him get up and answer the call. "Hello?" he said in a hoarse voice. "Mr. Miller, it's John from the corner store. I heard there was a fire in your garden. Is that true?" News traveled fast in the small community. Someone must have seen the smoke and spread the word. Antonio couldn't find words to explain what had happened. How could he tell them that a rich man had deliberately destroyed his livelihood? "It's true, John," he finally managed to respond. "I lost everything. My God, how did it happen? Was it an accident?" Antonio closed his eyes, feeling the weight of the decision he had to make. He could tell the truth and be called crazy, or invent a more acceptable version of events. But as he pondered, something inside him rebelled against the idea of protecting the man who had destroyed his life. "It wasn't an accident, John. It was a crime. Someone intentionally set my garden on fire." The silence on the other end of the line was as heavy as a tombstone. When John finally spoke, his voice was filled with disbelief and anger. Who would do such a thing? Who would be capable of destroying a lifetime's work? Antonio looked at the letter in his hands, with the name Sterling gleaming like a confession of guilt. "Richard Sterling," Antonio finally said, pronouncing the name as if it were a curse. "The owner of the development firm. He came here today and set my garden on fire because I refused to sell my land." The silence that followed on the other end of the line was even heavier than before. Antonio could imagine John processing the information, trying to understand how someone could be capable of such cruelty. "Mr. Miller, this is very serious. You need to go to the police immediately." "And who will believe the word of an old farmer against a rich businessman?" Antonio replied bitterly. "Besides, I have no proof." He was too careful. After the call, Antonio sat back on the porch, watching the last rays of sun illuminate the wreckage of his garden. The reality of his situation weighed on him like a mountain. 15 days to pay an impossible debt, with no source of income, and with a powerful enemy determined to destroy him. It was then he noticed something strange in Hope's behavior. The mare, who normally grazed peacefully until dusk, was standing near the fence, staring fixedly at a specific spot on the property. Her ears were perked up in maximum alert, and she shook her head rhythmically as if trying to draw attention to something important. "What is it, girl?" Antonio asked, getting up to follow the mare's gaze. Hope began to walk slowly along the fence, stopping every few feet to look back, checking if Antonio was following her. It was completely unusual behavior for her, almost as if she was trying to communicate something urgent. Intrigued and with nothing left to lose, Antonio decided to follow the mare. She led him to a part of the property further from the house, near a small grove of native trees his ancestors had preserved. It was a place he rarely went, as there was no practical need to tend to that area. Hope stopped before a centuries-old tree, an old oak that had witnessed 5 generations of the Miller family working that land. The mare began to paw at the ground with her hooves, something Antonio had never seen her do before. She would paw, stop to look at him, and then continue pawing in the same spot. "Hope, what are you doing?" he asked, approaching to examine the spot. The soil there looked different, looser than the rest, as if it had been disturbed recently, but that was impossible. No one had been in that part of the property for years. The mare continued her persistent work, and gradually a small depression began to form in the ground. It was then that something gleamed faintly in the twilight. Antonio knelt down and saw the corner of something metallic emerging from the earth. With his heart pounding, he began to dig with his bare hands, helping Hope in her mysterious discovery. The metal revealed itself to be a small box, old and rusty, but still intact. It was approximately the size of a shoebox, and surprisingly heavy for its size. "How did you know this was here, girl?" he asked Hope, who now watched calmly, as if her mission was accomplished. The box was closed with an old lock, but the rust had weakened the metal. With a little effort, Antonio managed to force it open. The creak of the opening lid echoed through the silent grove like the sigh of long-kept secrets. Inside the box, carefully wrapped in waxed cloth that had resisted the decades, were documents yellowed with age and, to his absolute surprise, several gold coins that gleamed like tiny suns in the golden twilight. Antonio picked up one of the coins with trembling hands. It was genuine, heavy, and bore the mark of a mint he recognized from stories his grandfather told about old times. It was as if Hope had found a buried treasure that could completely change the course of his tragedy. With reverent care, Antonio took the documents from the box, his fingers trembling as he unfolded papers that seemed to whisper stories of long-forgotten times. The first sheet he examined made his heart stop for a moment. It was a marriage certificate dated 1923, with his grandparents' names, Joaquin and Helen, written in elegant calligraphy. "Grandpa Joaquin and Grandma Helen," he murmured, feeling tears blur his vision. How did this end up here? Hope remained by his side, watching silently as if she understood the importance of that moment. The mare had become more than a pet. It was as if she were a guardian of family secrets, a mystical connection to the past he had never imagined. The second document was even more intriguing. A letter written in his grandfather's own hand, addressed to my descendants. The trembling handwriting revealed it had been written in old age, probably shortly before his death. Antonio brought the paper closer to his eyes, struggling against the growing darkness to decipher the words. "My dear grandson," the letter read, "if you are reading this, it means difficult times have come upon our family. As I always knew they would. This land has faced many storms, and sometimes it was necessary to hide what is most precious to protect it from predators." Antonio's hands trembled even more as he continued reading. His grandfather had predicted that someday someone would try to take the family property, and had prepared an emergency reserve. The gold coins were a lifetime savings, kept for the moment they were most needed. "These coins represent the sweat of 3 generations," the letter continued. "Your great-grandfather earned them working in the mines before buying this land. I preserved them through the Great Depression when many families lost everything. Now they are yours, but use them wisely. The land is worth more than any gold." There were 12 coins in total, each carefully wrapped in fine cloth. Antonio held them against the fading light, trying to calculate how much they might be worth today. Even without specialized knowledge, he knew that old gold coins had considerable value, especially for collectors. "But will it be enough?" he asked aloud, addressing Hope as if she could answer. "Will it be enough to pay off the debt and still have something left to start over?" The mare whinnied softly, a sound that sounded almost like encouragement. It was extraordinary how that animal seemed to understand not only human emotions, but also the complex situations they faced. A third document caught his eye, a rudimentary map of the property, hand-drawn with annotations in the margins. Antonio recognized his grandfather's handwriting, but the markings on the map were mysterious. There was an X marked in 3 different locations on the property, including the spot where they had found the box. Or could there be more buried treasures? He wondered, feeling a mix of hope and disbelief. If his grandfather had hidden other things on the property, perhaps there was a complete solution to his financial problems. But a moral dilemma began to form in his mind. Using those coins would mean parting with the last tangible connection to his ancestors. They were more than objects of value. They were symbols of sacrifice, honest labor, and family planning that spanned generations. On the other hand, losing the property would mean the entire family legacy would be destroyed anyway. Richard Sterling would transform that sacred land into concrete and asphalt, forever erasing the roots of 5 generations of the Miller family. The darkness was settling in quickly, but Antonio couldn't move away from that spot. He felt as if he was at the center of a moment that would define not only his fate, but the fate of his entire family line. Hope approached even closer, gently nudging her muzzle against his shoulder, as if to remind him he wasn't alone on this journey. Antonio carefully put the documents and coins back in the box, carrying it back home, while Hope accompanied him like a protective shadow. The night had completely fallen, and only the yellowish light from the porch lamp illuminated the path between the still-smoking wreckage of his garden. Inside, he placed the box on the kitchen table and turned on all the lights, feeling the need to push away the shadows that seemed more menacing than usual. The night's silence was broken only by the ticking of the old clock that had belonged to his parents, marking the time that relentlessly ticked down towards the 15-day deadline. It was then he heard the sound of cars approaching. It wasn't the familiar rumble of neighbors' vehicles, but powerful engines that slowed down near his property. Antonio ran to the front window and peeked through the curtain, feeling his blood run cold as he saw 2 dark cars parked on the road. The vehicles remained there for long minutes, with their engines running and headlights pointed at his house. It wasn't possible to see who was inside due to the dark windows, but the message was clear. He was being watched, intimidated, pressured to make a decision he didn't want to make. Hope, who had remained near the house, began to show signs of agitation. The mare paced nervously back and forth, whinnying softly and keeping her eyes fixed in the direction of the cars. It was as if she sensed the danger emanating from those unidentified visitors. The old telephone in the house rang abruptly, making Antonio jump. His first reaction was to let it ring, but something compelled him to answer. Perhaps it was intuition, or perhaps just curiosity about who would call at that hour. "Hello?" he said in a cautious voice. "Mr. Miller, it's John again. Sorry to call so late, but I'm worried about you. There are some strange cars cruising around here, and I heard they're in your area too." Antonio's heart quickened. If John had also noticed suspicious activity, it meant the intimidation was spreading beyond his property. "John, are you okay? Is your family safe?" "We're all fine, but I'm scared. I've never seen anything like this around here. They're expensive cars, with dark windows, just sitting on the roads watching houses. Folks in the village are saying it might be that Richard Sterling's doing." Antonio felt a wave of guilt wash over him. His resistance was putting not only himself, but the entire community at risk. This was exactly what Richard wanted, to spread fear, to completely isolate him. "John, listen closely," he said with a firm voice. "Keep your family indoors tonight. Lock everything up tight. Tomorrow we'll talk more about this." After the call, Antonio returned to the window. The cars were still there, motionless like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. He knew he wouldn't be able to sleep with that threatening presence outside, but he also knew he couldn't show fear. It was then that Hope did something extraordinary. The mare positioned herself strategically between the house and the road, taking on a stance Antonio had never seen before. It was as if she had appointed herself a sentinel, ready to protect her owner from any threat that might arise. Throughout the night, Hope kept vigil. Antonio watched her from the window, impressed with the animal's dedication. Whenever one of the cars made any movement, however slight, the mare positioned herself even more defensively, like a soldier guarding her post. Around 3 a.m, the cars finally left, but Hope remained at her post until dawn. It was only when the first rays of sun touched the property that she relaxed her vigilance and returned to grazing normally. Antonio understood that night that Hope was not just a pet. She was a companion who understood the subtleties of the situation they faced and was willing to face any danger by his side. With the dawn came a new determination. The gold coins might be the key to his salvation, but first he needed to find out exactly how much they were worth and if they would be enough to pay off the debt Richard had manipulated to control him. The morning sun brought with it an unexpected visitor. Antonio was on the porch, still absorbed in his thoughts about the gold coins, when a small red car pulled up in front of his property. A young woman, approximately 30 years old, got out of the vehicle carrying a camera and a notepad. "Good morning," she greeted with a clear, friendly voice. "My name is Caroline Davies, and I'm a journalist from the County Chronicle. I came here to do a story on family farming in the region, but I heard about the fire in your garden. Could I speak with you about what happened?" Antonio hesitated. His first reaction was to politely dismiss the journalist. He didn't want his situation to become a newspaper headline, but something in the young woman's sincere expression and the respectful way she addressed him made him reconsider. "I don't know if it'll be of interest to your paper, miss," he finally said. "It was just a fire in a small garden. Nothing too important." Caroline approached the fence, observing the blackened wreckage that still marked the spot where the garden had once thrived. "Mr. Miller, may I call you that? I've been in journalism for 8 years, and I've learned there are no small stories when they involve real people. What happened here seems far more complex than a simple accident." The journalist's perceptiveness impressed Antonio. She had immediately grasped that there was something more behind the destruction of his garden. Perhaps it was time for an outsider to know the truth about Richard Sterling and his cruel methods. "If you promise not to distort what I say, I can tell you what really happened," Antonio said, signaling for her to approach. Over the next hour, Antonio recounted all the details of the previous episode. Richard's arrival, the threats, the fuel poured over the plants, and finally, the arson. Caroline took notes rapidly, asking precise questions that demonstrated her understanding of the situation's gravity. "Mr. Miller, what you're telling me is extremely serious," she said when he finished his account. "It's extortion, it's environmental crime, it's property destruction, but I need more information to build a solid story." It was then that Antonio mentioned the collection agency letter with the Sterling name on it. Caroline asked to see the document, and her eyes lit up when she read the official letterhead. "This is the missing piece," she exclaimed. "If we can prove that Richard Sterling owns both the development firm and the collection agency, we have evidence of a financial manipulation scheme to force property sales." Caroline explained that there were other suspicious cases in the region. Small landowners who had been forced to sell their land under disadvantageous conditions after facing sudden financial difficulties. There was always a collection agency involved, always with impossible deadlines, she said. "But how will we prove all this?" Antonio asked. "To leave that to me," Caroline replied with determination. "I have contacts at the county records office, the state business registry, and I know people who can help me trace the connections between these companies." Hope approached during the conversation, as she always did when she sensed something important was being discussed. Caroline was impressed by the evident intelligence in the mayor's eyes. "She's special, isn't she?" commented the journalist, reaching out to stroke Hope's muzzle. "She seems to understand every word we say." "Hope saved my life yesterday," Antonio said, telling her about the discovery of the gold coins guided by the mayor. Caroline listened to the story with growing fascination. "Mr. Miller, you have much more than a story of injustice on your hands," she finally said. "You have a story of resilience, of connection to the land, and of an extraordinary partnership between a man and an animal. This can move far more people than just a complaint about abusive business practices." Caroline promised she would start her investigations immediately and would return in 2 days with more information. When she left, Antonio felt for the first time in days that he wasn't completely alone in his fight against Richard Sterling. Hope whinnied softly, as if approving the arrival of this new ally in the battle to come. Sunday dawned with a cloudy sky, as if nature itself sensed that this would be a decisive day. Even before the sun fully rose, Antonio was already awake, watching Hope through the window. The mare seemed restless, pacing back and forth with an energy he hadn't seen in weeks. Around 8 in the morning, the first community members began to arrive. John brought shovels and hoes. Rose carried baskets of food, and Caroline appeared with her camera, documenting everything for her report. The atmosphere was one of cautious hope. Everyone knew that day could change Antonio's destiny forever. Hope immediately took on the role of guide, heading for the second location marked on his grandfather's map. It was an area near the old well on the property, a place that had always held special meaning for the Miller family. The mare stopped exactly over a specific spot and began pawing with her hooves, repeating the behavior she had shown 2 days prior. "She really does know where to look," Caroline murmured, photographing the extraordinary moment. "It's like she has an ancestral connection to this land." The group began to dig carefully, everyone working in respectful silence. Antonio felt his heart pound with every handful of earth removed, while Hope watched the progress intently, occasionally whinnying as if giving instructions. It was John who found the second box. "There's something here," he shouted, making everyone gather around the small depression in the ground. This box was smaller than the first, but equally old and well preserved. When Antonio opened it, he discovered more gold coins and also some jewelry that had belonged to his great-grandmother. It was a modest treasure, but one that represented generations of family savings kept for moments of extreme need. "With this, you might be able to pay off the debt," Caroline said, mentally calculating the likely value of the items. "But we still need—" She was interrupted by the sound of cars approaching at high speed. 3 dark vehicles screeched to a halt at the property entrance, and Richard Sterling emerged from the first car, accompanied by 4 intimidating-looking men. What do you think you're doing on my property?" Richard shouted, marching towards the group with a furious expression. "This isn't your property," Antonio replied firmly, placing himself between Richard and the newly discovered box. "Not yet." "Oh, but it will be very soon," Richard retorted with a cruel smile. "I've brought the final documentation here. Either you accept my offer now, or tomorrow the marshals will come to take possession of everything." Caroline stepped forward, discreetly activating her phone's voice recorder. "Mr. Sterling, I'm a journalist and I'm documenting this situation. Could you repeat what you just said?" The businessman immediately sensed the danger of the press's presence. "I have nothing to declare to the press. Everyone off my property immediately." "This property still belongs to Mr. Miller," John said courageously, "and we are his guests." Richard gestured to his men, who began to approach the group menacingly. It was then that Hope did something no one expected. The mare positioned herself directly between the henchmen and the community, rearing on her hind legs and whinnying loudly, a sound that echoed across the property like a war cry. "Control that animal," Richard ordered. "Nobody controls Hope," Antonio said with pride in his voice. "She's defending her home, just like us." The tension in the air was palpable. Richard glared furiously at the box of treasures Antonio held, understanding that his financial extortion strategy might be neutralized. His calculating eyes quickly assessed his options, looking for a way to maintain control of the situation. "Very well," he finally said in a dangerously calm voice. "If you want to do this the hard way, we'll do it the hard way. But remember, I have resources you can't even imagine." With that veiled threat, Richard and his men returned to their cars and drove off, leaving a cloud of dust and a feeling that the real battle was just beginning. The following Monday, Caroline arrived at Antonio's property with a radiant smile and a special edition of the County Chronicle in her hands. The main headline blared, "Local developer accused of extortion against small farmers," accompanied by a photo of Hope defending the community. "Mr. Miller, you have to see this," she exclaimed, extending the newspaper. "The story is making a huge impact. The newsroom phone hasn't stopped ringing, with people offering support and reporting similar cases." Antonio held the newspaper with trembling hands, barely able to believe his story had gained such widespread attention. The report meticulously detailed Richard Sterling's scheme, including documents that proved the connections between his companies and the testimonies of other victimized families. "And there's more," Caroline continued, pulling another document from her bag. "The district attorney's office called this morning, based on our complaint and the evidence presented. They've launched an official investigation against Richard. Plus, the state attorney general's office is interested in the case." Hope approached, as she always did when she sensed good news was coming. The mayor seemed to understand that the atmosphere had shifted, that the tension of the past few days was finally dissipating. The house phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Antonio answered cautiously, still fearing it might be more threats. But the voice on the other end of the line brought an unexpected surprise. "Mr. Miller, this is Attorney Martinez, a lawyer specializing in agricultural law. I read the article in the paper and would like to offer my services free of charge for your case." In the following days, support multiplied extraordinarily. Farmers from across the region came forward as witnesses against Richard, reporting similar cases of intimidation and financial manipulation. The lawyer's office filled with documents and testimonies that built an irrefutable case against the developer. The gold coins and jewelry found were appraised by an expert who confirmed their historical and monetary value. The amount was sufficient not only to pay off the debt manipulated by Richard, but also to invest in the garden's recovery and still ensure a financial reserve for future emergencies. "It's as if your grandfather had predicted this exact situation," Caroline commented, watching Antonio caress Hope. He knew that one day the family would need these resources to defend the land. The definitive turning point came 2 weeks later, when the police executed search warrants at Richard Sterling's offices. Investigators found evidence of a much larger scheme than initially imagined. Documents revealed he had used the same tactics against dozens of small property owners in 3 different states. Richard was arrested attempting to destroy evidence, and his arrest was widely reported by the regional press. His companies were temporarily shut down, and a compensation fund was established to reimburse the victims of his schemes. Antonio received an official call informing him that his debt had been cancelled as part of the victim restitution process. Furthermore, Richard would be required to pay damages for the harm caused to the garden and for the emotional distress inflicted. "Justice finally prevailed," said John, who had become one of the leaders of the community movement that formed around the case. "And it all started with the courage of one man and the loyalty of a special mayor." Hope whinnied softly, as if approving the words. She had become a symbol in the region, the mayor who helped defeat greed with ancestral wisdom and unconditional protection. Antonio's garden began to be replanted with the help of the entire community. Seeds were donated by neighbors, the soil was treated by volunteer specialists, and within weeks, green returned to dominate the landscape that had been reduced to ashes. The legacy of 5 generations of the Miller family was finally safe, protected not only by formal justice, but by the power of community unity and the extraordinary connection between a man and his faithful companion. 3 months had passed since the day flames consumed Antonio Miller's garden. Now, the dawn of a golden Tuesday illuminated a completely transformed scene. Where there had once been only ashes and desolation, green rows of vegetables and legumes flourished again, appearing even more vibrant than before. Antonio walked slowly between the garden beds, his straw hat shielding him from the gentle morning sun. At 72, his steps carried a lightness he hadn't felt in decades. It wasn't just the financial relief that had renewed him, but the rediscovery that he wasn't alone in the world. Hope grazed peacefully near the fence, occasionally lifting her head to observe her owner with those intelligent eyes that had become famous throughout the region. Journalists from distant cities still visited the property to meet the mayor who saved a family, but she received all the attention with the serene dignity of one who had always known her importance. The garden was now more than a source of livelihood. It had transformed into a symbol of resilience and renewal. Visitors regularly came to hear the story of triumph, and many small farmers sought Antonio for advice on how to face similar pressures. "Mr. Miller," a familiar voice called out. Caroline approached, carrying a copy of the national newspaper that had published a special feature on the case. "More letters of support have arrived. People from all over the country are sending seeds and offering help." The farmer smiled, still surprised by the widespread impact his story had achieved. What began as a personal nightmare had transformed into a collective lesson on the importance of defending the fundamental values of rural life. Near the spot where Hope had found the first treasure, a special garden now grew. Antonio had decided to plant there the rarest and oldest varieties of seeds he had received as donations, creating a space dedicated to the preservation of traditional agriculture. It was his way of honoring his grandfather's memory and ensuring that ancestral wisdom would be passed down to future generations. "The school children arrive in an hour for their visit," Caroline reminded him. "Do you remember what you arranged with the teacher?" Antonio nodded, smiling as he thought of the activity that had become one of his greatest joys. Every week, school groups visited the property to learn about sustainable agriculture and hear the story of how community unity can overcome injustice. The children were always fascinated by Hope, who seemed to understand her educational role and behaved with exemplary patience during the visits. Many of them drew the mayor in their notebooks, creating small works of art that Antonio carefully preserved. John arrived shortly after, carrying empty baskets that would soon be filled with the week's harvest. The corner store had become a distribution point not only for Antonio's produce, but for a cooperative network that had emerged after the events of the previous months. "The co-op folks want to know if you'd accept being their honorary president," John said with a proud smile. "It was your courage that inspired us all to unite." Antonio considered the proposal while watching Hope interact affectionately with a group of children who had arrived early. The mayor let them touch her mane and patiently posed for photographs, as if she knew she was an important part of the story being told. "I accept," he finally said, "but only if Hope is named the official cooperative mascot." Everyone laughed, but it was a serious suggestion. The mayor had become much more than a pet. She was a living symbol that wisdom, loyalty, and connection to the land can overcome any adversity. When the sun set that afternoon, painting the sky in golden hues that reflected on the green leaves of the renewed garden, Antonio sat on the porch beside Hope. The mare had positioned herself so she could rest her head on her owner's shoulder, a gesture of affection that had become a daily ritual. There, contemplating the land that 5 generations of his family had cultivated with love, Antonio understood that some victories transcend the individual. His resistance had protected not only his property, but strengthened an entire community and inspired distant people to value what truly matters. The seeds planted in that soil were more than growing vegetables. They were seeds of hope that would continue to flourish far beyond his own existence.